I would like to welcome you to this panel discussion on lifetime of learning. Each year, we invite senior scholars in our field to look back at their own journey as scholars. Their individual stories will help us reflect on the larger story of how our field has developed. This year's panelists include two pioneers in the fields of feminist and womanist study of religion, Judith Plaskow and Geneva Cannon. They will talk about the development of their scholarship, activism, and their communities of accountability. First, I want to introduce Geneva Cannon, who is the Andy Scales Rogers Professor of Christian Ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary. In 1983, Cannon became the first African-American woman to receive a PhD from Union Theological Seminary in New York. She was also the first African-American woman to be ordained in the United Presbyterian Church, USA. Cannon focuses her work in the areas of Christian ethics, womanist theology, and women in religion and society. She has lectured nationally on theological and ethical topics, and is the author or editor of numerous articles and 7 books, including Katie's Canon, Womanism and the Soul of the Black Community, and Black Womanist Ethics. Judith Plaskow is a past president of the American Academy of Religion. She is professor of religious studies at Manhattan College. Her scholarly interests focus on contemporary religious thought with a specialization in feminist theology. She received a BA from Clark University and an MA and PhD from Yale University. Plaskow has lectured widely on feminist theology in the United States and Europe. She co-founded the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion and co-edited it for its first 10 years. She is also the author of 3 books, Sex, Sin, and Grace, Woman's Experience, and the Theologies of Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective, and The Coming of Lilith, Essays on Feminism, Judaism, and Sexual Ethics, 1972 to 2003. In addition, Plaskow has co-edited 3 other volumes, Women and Religion, Woman's Spirit Rising, a Feminist Reader in Religion, and Weaving the Visions, New Patterns in Feminist Spirituality. I will first interview Katie and Judith, and towards the end, you will have opportunities to ask questions. So I start with Katie. I want to ask when and how you began to do womanist work.
I think the most important date in my formation as a womanist thinker was April 4th, 1968, the day Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I arrived at Nova Scotia College in September 1967 as a Negro. On April 4th, 1968, I became Black. We were at a little small Presbyterian mission school in Concord, North Carolina, and King's assassination was enough to make me want to give my life. I was ready to take on the Klan. I was ready to burn Concord, North Carolina down. And there was enough of freedom riders and people who had participated in the civil rights movement who were juniors and seniors at the college who knew that if we went to the streets, those of us who were first-year students, we would be mowed down by the Klan. And so they locked us in the chapel, and they would only let us go to the bathroom and bring food in. And for 3 days, we cried, we screamed, we rocked, we mourned. We grieved because what King represented for us is that we wouldn't have to go to the back of the bus anymore. We wouldn't have to, we would be allowed to go to public libraries and to the skating rinks and to the Y and to be part of the U.S. culture. And for his assassination, and for us, it meant the killing of a dream. And so that was the day I started wearing African dashikis. I had my Black Power fist. I had my strap-up sandals. And my mother said not only was I black, but I was ultra black. There were no black people before me. There were no black people after me. I was the only black person that ever lived. And if anybody slipped in my family and said Negro or colored, I got on my soapbox and I explained that we were not Negro people, we were not colored people, we were black people. And so my mother had pictures around the living room like I was deceased. They didn't know this person. And so that was a turning point for me. It was April 4th, 1968. And I was so grateful that the civil rights trainers who had been trained in the nonviolent movement, they saved a heap of us that day because we didn't care whether the Klan killed us or not. They had killed King and we were ready to retaliate. And that was a turning point for me.
Thank you, yes. Judith, I know that you are a pioneer in the study of women and religion. Can you tell us how did you begin your work?
Certainly. I became a feminist in the fall of 1969, which was when Yale admitted women to the undergraduate college. The university prepared for women's education by putting full-length mirrors in the women's bathrooms and hiring a gynecologist for the health center. And 3 graduate women called a meeting to discuss how it was that we'd been at Yale for 80 years and no one had noticed. I think we could have done without the full-length mirrors, but we wouldn't have minded having a gynecologist in the health center. And maybe 40 or 50 women showed up for the meeting, maybe 3 of whom would have defined themselves as feminists. And we began meeting weekly for consciousness raising and activism. And in the course of that fall, I underwent what I really have to describe as a conversion. And one of the other women at the first meeting was Carol Christ, who was the other female graduate student in theology, and we went out afterwards and we started talking about our graduate program, and it was the first time that we noticed that we never had a single book or article assigned by a woman. And that was the point at which we started to ask why and what does this mean for the field.
Thank you. Katie, you start using the term womanist. Can you explain why you have chosen that term and what were the turning points in your own research and scholarship?
I'll start with the turning points in my scholarship and research. When I had reached to finish all my coursework with Bev Harrison in ethics, and she said, well, what do you want to write for your dissertation? I said, I want to tell the story of the black girls and boys who desegregated the schools in the South. I wanted to interview the teachers who had desegregated the schools, who were the English professors and the math teachers and social studies, and yet when they went over to the white schools, they put them on cafeteria duty and bus duty. I wanted to tell their story before they died out. As James Baldwin said, somebody's going to have to give account of sending out children before the Gestapo. And Bev said to me, but you're not a social scientist. You're a theoretician. This is a PhD, a doctorate in philosophy. So I had to find a body of literature I could write about. I've always loved reading. I've been a bookworm as long as I've been. I don't even know a conscious moment when I didn't know how to read. But when I was in seminary at ITC, a guy by the name of Rocky Antonio Lawrence had given me a photocopy of a photocopy of Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so back in 1970, you couldn't get copies of Zora Neale Hurston's work. And so to have this photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy was sacred text. And I remember it was the first text I'd ever read of black idiomatic expressions. And I took it home that Christmas and I said to my mother, we were sitting at the kitchen table, I said, Mom, listen to this. And she said, You mean you're going to get a master's? You can go on the front porch and hear people talk like this all the time. I said, that's it, Mom, that's it. That's why I've got to do this work. So when I realized I needed a body of literature, instead of going out and interviewing the generation that desegregated the schools, Zora Neale Hurston, being the most prolific black woman in the United States between 1925 and 1960, became my spirit guide, became the person whose work was most important. And then to find out, and as I started working with Hurston, that Alice Walker had started finding her grave and had started also considering her as a foremother. And then when Alice coined the word womanist, it all lined up. As Howard Thurman said, the yeses in life started to line up.
Thank you. Judith, you started quite differently. You start your first book working not on Judaism, but on two Christian theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. So can you also tell us the twists and turns of your own research and scholarship?
Sure. I went to graduate school to get a degree in Protestant theology because I wanted to be a theologian. And at that point, there was no place in the country to go to study Jewish theology. And I would say through the mid-70s, I would keep finding myself on lists of Protestant theologians. And when I read my work from that period, I really get it. I mean, I wouldn't know that I wasn't a Protestant theologian when I read my thesis. And so when I finished, I really went through a kind of identity crisis because what was I going to do next? I couldn't be a Christian theologian. And so at a certain point, I realized that although I wasn't trained in Jewish studies, I was going to have to be a Jewish theologian.
Thank you. Both of you combined your scholarship with activism. And can you tell us something about how did you do that? And the talk about the issues of accountability.
One of the ways I have taken my work from town to gown and gown to town is that I'm a seventh generation African-American Presbyterian, meaning from the time my ancestors arrived here from the continent of Africa, we've been part of the Presbyterian tradition. Being that I'm from North Carolina, we were part of the Presbyterian tradition that was anti-slavery. So we were always connected with the Northern Presbyterian Church, meaning I grew up thinking the Presbyterian Church was a historical black denomination. Every now and again, a white person from New York or Philadelphia, wherever the headquarters, would come down and do a workshop. But my church was all black, my presbytery was all black, my center was all black. I knew thousands of black Presbyterians. I had never seen but maybe 3 or 4 white Presbyterians. So I really thought I was in a black denomination. And you can imagine my surprise going to General Assembly and realizing we were 2% of the denomination. It's like, well, what happened to all the black people? So part of my activism has always been the training in my church school as well as my academic is that whatever I was blessed with, I owed back to the community. So I've always been involved on Wednesday night Bible studies in every city I've ever lived. I've been part of a historical black Presbyterian church. I've taught Bible studies. Sometimes we'd have 60 and 70 lay people come to the Bible studies. That's one involvement. Another is I've lectured across this country and other parts of the world as a way of taking the information from the academy out to the larger community, working with lay people, young people. So also trying now to work more across disciplines with social workers, psychologists, people in the green movement, environmentalists, just trying to have as many conversations with people who understand the well-being for all of us.
Yes. Can you also address the same question?
Yeah, I have to say that I have never thought of myself as an activist, that my work is about the feminist transformation of Judaism and of religious studies, and so that led me into, I guess, what you'd call activism as simply an extension of my work, but I always just saw it as part of my work. So within this organization, I was one of the people who I co-chaired the Women in Religion group in its second and third years, and I saw it from a group to a section when Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and I felt that there needed to be a journal in feminist studies and religion. We talked about it for a few years, and then one evening at a cocktail party at the AR, we said, all right, let's just do it, you know, and we went and talked to a press. And I also went through a long period of running all around the country, speaking to synagogues and students about the feminist transformation of Judaism and religion more broadly.
I want to share a story. When I was a junior scholar, I published an essay in the Journal of Feminist Study and Religion, and so I received the proofs, and lo and behold, the instruction said, if you need to change anything, you should let Judith Plaskow know. Wow, I said Judith Plaskow, not one of her students or a teaching assistant, should take care of those details of praise and page proofs. I was just amazed. And she did it, as I just announced, for 10 years. So we are very grateful for what you have done for all the scholars who are working in women and religion. Now, as pioneers, I am sure both Katie and Judith have encountered difficulties in their career. So I asked them to be courageous enough to tell you one or two those stories. I think I would start with Judith, you first.
Oh, it's all been a piece of cake, Blue.
Yes, I know.
Actually, I would say the difficulties began with my dissertation when the director of graduate studies said to me that my theological point was well taken, but why did I have to connect it to women? And that was a point at which dissertation proposals were circulated to the whole department, and there were a number of people who tried to torpedo the proposal. And it was thanks to Julian Hart, who died in the last year, that I was able to continue with my dissertation. Then one of the first jobs I applied for, I didn't get an interview because a few months before, Carol Christ and I had published an article on the acknowledgement to the wife in scholarly books. And it was called a form-critical study in the art of acknowledgement, and we talked about wife as co-author, wife as wife, wife as typist, and so on. And the chair of the department where I'd applied for a job called me and said that they weren't going to interview me because they couldn't imagine what kind of person could have written that article. And I don't know why he called. Maybe he wanted to hear my voice on the phone, and you know. But it was really a kind of wake-up call that the kind of work that I was doing and that I wanted to do was going to have consequences.
Thank you. How about you, Kim?
I entered the academy at the doctoral level thinking if you had the intellect, it would be just smooth sailing all the way. It would be a piece of cake. And to my surprise, I didn't understand that a PhD is 75% political. And so I had no idea how to read the invisible transcript. I had no idea how to analyze the power. So I'd always loved Hebrew scripture, so I was going to get a PhD in Hebrew Bible at Union Seminary in New York. Finished all the coursework and was about ready to start looking at my proposal when my advisor at that point called me in and said he would not, in good conscience, sign for me to get my Ford Foundation grant renewed. And without the Ford Foundation grant, I didn't have money to continue in the PhD program. It was during the Holy Week of Monday, and it was a Monday, Thursday service. I was pastoring a church over in East Harlem in New York. And the sermon was already prepared because I'd learned in seminary you always have it in a spiritual incubator at least 3 days before time to deliver. But as the scripture says about Samson, when it says, and the spirit left him, I had no energy to deliver this sermon. But once I got over to the church, 75% of the people in the congregation had gotten pink slips from the city of New York saying they no longer had jobs. And I thought then, and they started singing the spiritual, there is a balm in Gilead. And I said, going to school is a privilege. These women and men got to feed children. They were walking up 20 flights of stairs because most of the time the elevators weren't working. I said, I can do this. So I took a year off, joined the faculty at New York Theological, started the PhD over in ethics. My Hebrew didn't count, my Greek didn't count, my Aramaic didn't count. I guess those were my mother tongues and I didn't know them. I had to pay thousands of dollars to learn how to read German so I could write about African American women. And I remember when I switched over and I said I was debating whether I was going to do work with Dr. Cohn in theology or work with Bev in ethics. I said, well, I've been in the black church all my life and I know black theology. I've read everything Dr. Cohn had published. I said, let me go see what these white feminists are doing. And so I switched over and Bev said to me, we're surprised you lasted that long. It had already been determined I was not going to get a PhD, but nobody told me. And then when I started working with Bev, I would write drafts of things and she'd say, no, we know you can't be a better white man than a white man. You can't be a better white woman than a white woman. You can't be a better black man than a black man. You're a black woman, you bring something to the academy we've never had before, and that's what we want. I said, why is this white woman trying to trick me? So I would put the dead white people in that again. She said, no, we got that already. And she would go through this list. And finally, by the third time, I said, I'm just going to leap on faith. And I said, you mean you want me to write about what my mama, my grandma, my daddy taught? She said, that's it. Never before had anyone said that had value. Never before did I understand that it had academic currency. So it was clearly a faith act to believe that Bev was directing me in a way that I was going to hit this mother lode of wisdom and knowledge that was coming up from the very being of who I am.
Thank you very much. How do you see the generation difference among women scholars, Judith, as one of the senior scholars?
Well, I think that feminist studies in religion has become professionalized in a way that it wasn't in the first generation, that we were really writing for our lives in a way that doesn't feel like it's the case anymore. And I had occasion a couple of years ago to reread the papers from the first 2 or 3 years of the Women in Religion group, and I was really struck by how even the most academic of the papers explicitly connected itself with the movement for women's liberation. And there are some young women for whom that's true, but it doesn't feel the same. And so that's a change I regret. A positive change is the interrogation of a lot of the categories that we were working with. I mean, you know, it's a new generation that's made me realize that my attachment to the word woman reinscribes the gender binary. And that's been a really important learning that's pushed feminist thought in new directions.
Your first book talks about women's experience, right? And then there have been a lot of discussions of women's experience. Mm-hmm. Have you had a second thought if you were to republish the book or add preface or addendum? What would you have to say?
Well, you know, I have to say that I am proud of the fact that even in 1973, I said, when I say women's experience, I'm writing from the perspective of white, middle class, North American women's experience. So I think I always had that awareness. And I know that the concept of women's experience is homogenizing and essentializing and all those things. I can't totally let go of it, provided that it's properly nuanced, because, you know, when I read Jewish rabbinic literature in which women are objects and not subjects of discourse, I don't know how to talk about transformation without bringing in the experiences of Jewish women, and I could say Jewish women in that period, or, you know, nuance it. I'm much more aware of that nuancing, but I'm not totally willing to give up the concept.
Thank you very much. There has also been a debate on the term womanism. And how do you see the generation difference? Some of them question the use of it. They call themselves black feminists. Others said that the womanism is so heterosexual in its construction. Katie, can you respond to some of those concerns?
Now, some of the additional concerns with the word womanism and womanist is that I've talked with African-American young women who they say in relation to some of the men, they like the fact that they're womanists because, as opposed to feminists, because they don't have to take them seriously. So they see it as a lukewarm kind of word that they don't have to engage. I've seen and heard other people say that womanist is synonymous with mammy. And it's not that they've done any of the reading or any of the research, it's just, it's a word that's foreign to them and they impose their definition onto it. My concern as a senior person in the academy is just realizing more and more how my life is considered not only ancient history, but antiquity. When I had last fall I was teaching undergraduates at Virginia Commonwealth University, and they did not know that on the day King was assassinated that there were riots. I said more than 200, and they were just surprised. A student, and these are people born in 1990 and 91. A student just the other day asked me, who's Angela Davis? I wanted to go home and get my free Angela button and come back with all my free Angela posters, and I was like, no. So I just said, read the autobiography and then we'll talk. And so that which I took for granted, my generation, when I went to seminary, 1/3 of the men had just come back from Vietnam. The other third were at seminary to keep from going to Vietnam, and then there were these board preachers, men who had been told since they were 3 or 4 they were going to be ministers. And so now to be 61, almost 62, and meeting and talking and teaching young people who things I take for granted are nowhere on their purview makes me realize I have to be very intentional about not assuming that they know what I know and how to build that into the teaching process. And so it's the same thing with the understanding and educating about what womanism is about, how to read Alice Walker, why we read Alice Walker. There are people who are saying because she's not Christian, then how can those of us in the Christian tradition use her as a foundational theorist? And those of us who've been around long enough, it's not a problem for us. Another cutting edge, I think, for the younger generation is that the binaries of race no longer are operative. There's so many multiracial people in the world who are not just black, white, honorary, imposable black, or Asian, and they mix with all of who we are, and so how do they identify, and how do we give them space to self-name? And all of that is part of the womanist agenda. Is that it's organic, it's alive, it's dynamic, and it's fluid. So.
Judith, I heard you telling the stories that when you first came to the AR, there were so few women. Can you just tell the story again?
You could fit the women who were members of the academy into a room, and a room that was a lot smaller than this one. It was extraordinary, and I remember a meeting in the early 70s in which there were prostitutes in the lobby of the hotel. And, it's, I almost can't believe some of my own memories and my own experience. And in 1971, the year that the Women's Caucus was founded, and that's maybe one of 5 years that I skipped the AAR, because I had actually dropped out of my graduate program intending never to return. But in that year, there were 8 identifiably female names on the program out of 237 presenters.
Wow. Yes. There is a famous story about Katie. She couldn't almost finish presenting her paper when she attended the meeting and was asked to do so. Why did you faint? She fainted.
I stood up in the ballroom at the American Academy of Religion in Chicago. Bev Harrison's book, I Right to Choose, had just come out. People were there, we call it the OK Corral, because we knew that people were there to fight against women's bodily integrity and our right to choose. And I was one of the presenters about the book. I stood up right behind the podium and fainted cold. They called the hotel physician, came and gave me smelling salt. They tell me they don't give people smelling salt anymore, but that's what he did. As soon as I gained conscious, I'm still on the floor. He asked me, "Are you pregnant?" I said, "I'm pregnant with possibilities." I know a whole lot of black women are not going to have a chance if I mess up. So I've got to deliver this paper. So I stood up to read the paper, and the audience asked me, "Give us a few more minutes. We just saw you die and come back. Give us a few more minutes." So I waited a few more minutes till the audience got themselves together, and I read my paper. It felt very much like, if you've seen the Saturday Evening Post, Ruby Bridges, a little 6-year-old desegregated school in New Orleans, and that kind of incredible responsibility when people are not believing black women can think, that we can cogitate, speculate, that we're not intellectuals, and people just assume we're part of the janitorial service or we're there to do some kind of menial labor. And so when we stand up as the intellectual, the scholar, it discombobulates people. But the pressure to be the black woman scholar, knowing that other sisters and brothers outside the door waiting for a chance, there's so much pressure to do it right, to be what I call a Reggie Jackson, to knock it out the ballpark every time, that you got to be ready. And so that pressure is what knocked me unconscious.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to tie in with the theme, lifetime in scholarship. I want to ask if Judith and Katie, you will be sharing with us what have been your reading habit. Do you just read in your field, or you read very widely?
That's really changed over time. I think, when I first started doing feminist work and it felt like it was possible to read everything, I tried to read everything. And as the scholarship has multiplied enormously, my reading has necessarily narrowed. So I'm not, first of all, I'm not even sure what my field is, so it would be hard for me to say what it means to read only in my field. And as someone who teaches at an undergraduate college where I'm teaching service courses, and so constantly trying to bring in new material and things that have nothing to do with my research, I read for a variety of purposes, but I do not read as broadly as I did 30 years ago.
What about you, Katie?
I read across the disciplines. I'm always reading literature. That's my spiritual inspiration, reading novels and short stories, reading plays. That is just what I do when I'm calming down. And so I try to stay on top of everything that my favorite writers publish. But in terms of my students, as co-learners, they are pushing the envelope on the things I'm reading. For instance, there's a young woman who's doing an independent study with me on video games and the ethics implicit in playing video games. Well, as the person who's never played a video game, I think I did Atari, the little yellow thing that used to eat things up. What was that one? Pac-Man. I did Pac-Man. So now I'm having to read about the gaming world and what it means to live in a virtual world, and what does it mean for people to have change their identities and have money out there. It's like, so the students are forcing me to read other things because I can't evaluate the work they're doing. I give them the ethical containers to put the work in, and they put new work in, which means I got to now read new stuff to be able to know what they're doing.
Yes.
So the students keep pulling me forward.
Thank you. Do you have any advice to the graduate students, Judith?
Yeah, I think that there are a few things that I would say to graduate students. One is that it's absolutely crucial to build connections among students in your program and outside of your program. That is what will push you forward in your thinking and enable you to survive. And I see that as I know I could not have gotten through graduate school without Carol, and I see the networks that people create as absolutely crucial. I would also say, because I hear a lot of graduate students say that they've been advised not to do feminist or womanist work until they have tenure, not to write about queer issues until they have tenure. Don't let anyone talk you out of doing the work that you came into the field to do. However kindly the advice is meant, I can't tell you that you won't be punished if you do insurgent work. The likelihood is you will be punished. But if you're not doing the work of your heart, what's the point? And the third thing that I would say is, if you don't like what you see in your program and in the field or at the AAR, then get together with other people and change it. We did, you can. Yeah, and I think, you know, we were graduate students. I was just beginning my dissertation when I became co-chair of the Women in Religion group of the AAR. You know, we made a way out of no way, as women like to say, and this generation can do the same thing.
Thank you. How about you, Katie?
I would ditto everything Judith said. I would add that if there's a door, go through the door and not through the wall. You'd be surprised how many graduate students, their head bloody and bowed, they're suffering from migraine, acid reflux, inflamed sciatic nerve, everything you can think of, because they keep bumping into a concrete wall when the door is right there. And part of that I've found, especially among women graduate students, is that we go overboard trying to prove that we're as smart as we are. When we know in our gut what we want to write about, we know in our heart of hearts what we've been called to write about, but for somewhere we've been socialized to believe that that's not academic excellence. And so instead of following our heart and going through the door, we try to bump up against a concrete brick wall and then give up. Go through the door. The second is, pay attention to the invisible transcript. Learn how to read, because as faculty, sometimes we have to talk in code. Because if we tell you straight up, then you go and tell people we said it. You know, if I said, if this person doesn't believe you can think, I'd say, no, you shouldn't read it. Why not look at this class? Why not think about doing it this way? No, it's like, then you just let hard-headed people go hard-headed ways. But if I'm trying to tell you something in code, pay attention. And I may even say, I'm talking to you in code if you don't get it. I'm in code mode now, listen. And I guess the third would be that, as Howard Thurman says, the yeses in life do line up. And if you're paying attention, when those doors start to close, as they say, a window always opens. But oftentimes we determine to make that which is not going to be a possibility happen, and we use up too much life energy in making it happen, because it's not going to happen. Like when I got put out of the Hebrew Bible program and moved over into ethics, I'm a natural born ethicist. I have to see that as a gift, as opposed to always begrudging the fact or trying to force people who had already decided, as Bev said, that I wasn't supposed to last that long, to make them do what they're not going to do. So it's like paying attention to the yeses in life as they line up.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. We know that only a few of you will be able to ask questions. And so we have the note cards, the index cards on the chairs. And because both Judith and Katie would love to hear what you have to ask, but you may not have the opportunities of coming to the central aisle to use the microphone. Both of them would love to hear what are your questions, and they may be also pondering, developing their thought further, and to publish something along the lines that they have spoken. So your questions will be very helpful. So if you have questions, be sure to write it on those cards, and we will collect them at the end of this session. So now I am going to open the floor for questions.
Good afternoon, and thank you both. I want to salute you and thank you for your tremendous contributions to the Academy, for your scholarly and academic excellence. This was a wonderful panel, and my questions are practical. My name is Karen Weaver. I'm from Princeton University, and I have an administrative role there as a dean, and one of the questions that keep coming up with the students and many of the newer faculty as well relates to self-care. And I wanted to know if you could share some of the academic disciplines that you've incorporated in your career, as well as address some of the self-care issue and some of the mental and psychological health risks that come along with being an academic, as well as those of us who are active in our various faith communities. Are there ways of addressing anxiety, depression, health issues, et cetera, that come along with the work that we do? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think for me, the most important piece of self-care is creating community with others. I mean, that's absolutely fundamental to sanity and survival. And, you know, certainly as a graduate student, this was said actually in the womanist session just before this. You know, Carol and I used to call each other all the time and say, am I crazy? Or was this an outrageous thing to say or to do? And without that community, it would be impossible for me to get through. The other thing is I sing in a chorus. And even when it's really hard because it meets on a night that's not so great in terms of my schedule, for me, that's a piece of survival and self-care also, remembering that I have a life outside the academy in a variety of ways. That's one of them.
I would think the community is key. It's the fact that the three of us are friends. We read each other's work. We've been coming to the academy together. And so being here before you today just feels so natural. I follow Poulan's daughter. I followed her daughter since she was a tiny child. I followed Judith's son. I was at his bar mitzvah. So so we not only do we read each other's work, we respect each other as individuals and as people. And so it's like Judith and I have talked so many times. Can you have all three? Can you have an academic rigorous life? Can you have a passionate love life? And can you have healthy children? And Judith has made it very clear, because at one point I was thinking about adopting. She said you can have two really strong, but you can't have all three. And so you have to decide. So, you know, there are people who have wonderful children and never published anything. And then wonder why they never get tenure. They just keep having to move. There are other people who have publications galore. Their children are just running wild everywhere. And every time you see them, they lovey-dovey stuff. So it's like you have to decide which of those three are going to be top, you know. And so that it doesn't end up being a sucker punch. It needs to be a very conscious, deliberate, meditative decision that people make. I mean, there are a lot of people they lose relationships with every degree because they don't tend to them. And then they wonder, how did this happen? Well, anything we don't tend to dies. So you got to tend to it. So I too try to have a life outside of the academy, I'm basically a hermit though. I like being a hermit. I love being a hermit. So I have to intentionally be friendly. I have to intentionally engage. One of the things I learned with Letty and others is that as women in the academy, we have to set boundaries. Mm-hmm. And 99%, I don't interact with students in my house. they're not my friends that I hang out with. And so they may hear some of my jokes, but they don't hear my real jokes, you know. So I'm a comedian on the side. Okay, so Bev, I remember saying 1% of students will regret the 99 that didn't mess up. And so you never know when that 1% of student can't deal with you as a friend. And so I just keep the boundaries very clear. And I think some people can handle it, some people can handle being faculty and friends, some people can't. But every person needs to know what they can and cannot deal with.
Actually, I'd like to add another word as somebody who's tried to have all three and in some sense has all three. I spent a lot of years of my career feeling that I had everything that I wanted in my life except the time to enjoy it. And at some point I realized that when you say yes to too many things, even if every one of them individually is something that you'd really like to do and are really committed to, and then you lose the capacity to enjoy it, you've lost everything. So you really have to say, that sounds wonderful, you know, in another life, in 5 years, I'll say yes to it, but I need to set limits now.
I was working so hard at one point I had stopped going to worship. I built that back in. I belonged to 2 health clubs. I paid my dues. I'm gonna start going.
Thank you. Another question, yes.
Yes, thank you so much, both of you. That was a nice segue to my question, which is things I'd really like to hear about things you've allowed yourself, learned about yourselves, ways in which you've understood yourselves to grow or transform or come into yourself in a way in your 50s and 60s that just wasn't there before or just was growing or coming into fruition before that?
I had to learn that I was a public persona. I did not know that. I remember when I first got ordained in 1974, and a young woman came up to me and asked me to autograph her bulletin at the church. I fell out laughing. I mean, I've been over laughing. I mean, I could see somebody asking for Aretha Franklin's autograph or Angela Davis' autograph, but my autograph, and the young woman started crying, and and I never did that again. And I remember sitting in my office one day, and I said, the phone rang, and I said, good morning, Katie Cannon. And the person said, may I speak to Katie Cannon? I said, speak, and she said, this is the Katie Cannon, the real Katie Cannon? I said, yes. She said, I'm gonna have to call you back. I said, she said, I was expecting a secretary to answer, I'm not ready to talk to the real Katie Cannon. And I said, okay, I'll be here. And about 15 minutes later, she called back. And then we were at the bicentennial of Black Presbyterians in Philadelphia. And my niece was there, and she said, hey, Kate, there's a woman here who wants to meet you. And there was an older woman, she must have been about 75 or older, and my niece, Beth, took me over to meet this woman, and she said, this is my Aunt Kate. And the woman said, you're Katie Cannon? I said, yes. And she fell down on her knees. I said, please get up. She said, I can now die and go meet my Savior. It was like, oh, Lord, get up, get up. This did not feel good. Please, lady, please stand up, please stand up. So I've had to learn in all the ways, in therapy and everywhere, what it means when I leave my house, I'm a public person. Even to go to the grocery store, the kind of way you have to have your hair combed and be presentable. You just can't run to the store because people say, there's Katie Cannon. You know? So that was, learning to be a public persona has been a major growing edge for me. And so I'm a public persona today, but Judith had to even help me to get to this panel.
Yeah, but Judith, I mean, I'm not the same public persona as Katie Cannon, but I also struggle with that, and I don't think that I deal with it very well, but that my impulse is always to say, oh, you know, cut it out, I'm just me.
And I go super loud.
But I think, you know, I find myself constantly growing and learning and changing. I spent last spring in Cordoba, Spain, because of work my partner was doing, not my own. And I really understood for the first time the Ashkenazi centrism of my work. I mean, I knew it in theory, but I got it, and I got that my attitude towards Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews had really been Orientalist, and I really see the Jewish people differently, and that's something that just happened, and I haven't yet figured out how it's going to affect my work and what it's going to mean, but things like that there are always growing edges.
Yeah, if I could just follow up briefly, are there permissions you've given yourselves in these decades that you didn't in your 30s and 40s, permissions you've given yourselves is the best way I can put it.
Yeah, I was working on a book on sexuality. I guess, I mean, in the 90s, I was doing more and more work on issues of sexuality, and I thought I would write a book on sexuality, and I had a year at Radcliffe working on it, and I realized I wasn't enjoying it, that in the essays I had written, I had said what I wanted to say, I had addressed the issues that were most important to me, and I gave myself permission to stop writing it. And I said to myself, wait, at this point in your career, if you're not enjoying what you're writing, why would you write it? And that was a big shift for me, because I sure didn't enjoy my dissertation.
I would just say that I say to all my advisees, every doctoral student that I work with, get a wise person, get into therapy. I say, I can help you get a dissertation, but I can't stop the tapes going in your head. I can't stop the looping messages that says that you're dumb, you don't have a right to do this, who do you think you are? I say, if you can get a wise person to help you with that part, I can help you navigate the other part. And then people, when I would be out lecturing, and I started talking about, my therapist said this, and they said, why do you tell people in public that you're in therapy? I said, otherwise I'd be chasing cars barking at the moon. I'm glad I got a good therapist. I mean, you don't come from where I've come from and be who I am without somebody translating how to do it without hurting myself. Because I used to laugh at the wrong time, talk at the wrong time, ask questions at the wrong time. So my therapist said this, I just need you to teach, I'm going to teach you how to get in touch with your white self. And that's what she taught me how to do.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, the last question.
Thank you. I just started teaching 1 year into my first post, and already my students have kind of got the message, if you go to one of her classes, you're going to be hit over the head with feminism. But I'm kind of struggling with my students with the I'm not a feminist but narrative that they're telling me. And I was just wondering if you had any reflections on that in your own experiences, or any strategies you could give me so that I can go and teach them and they can stop doing the I'm not a feminist but story.
Maybe you should start.
I have the same, actually my students don't even say but. They just say I'm not a feminist. And actually I use Christine Gurev's book on sexual ethics in my sexuality class. And I was asking my students at one point to reflect on it as a feminist text, and one student said, it's not feminist. And I said, what do you mean it's not feminist? And the student said, well, what she's saying is true. So, I mean, what I try to do is ask them to reflect on what their images and stereotypes of feminists are, and juxtapose that to the reality of some of the material that we're reading. But it's something that I continue to struggle with, too.
The way I remember teaching at Temple University, the undergrad courses in religion, and the students would say, why do you think this is liberationist? This is just religion. Because it was like there was no other reference point for them. when I'm out doing work at the church and with lay people and in retreats and conferences, if I mention the word womanist, they'll say, we don't want to do it. But everything I'm doing is womanist. And as long as they don't know that's womanist, then we get it done. So sometimes I name it and sometimes I don't. But I know if I'm doing it, it's womanist. And they just go with it, and they love it. And so sometimes not knowing is what allows them to do it.
Thank you. If you have other questions, be sure to put down on the index cards. We'll be collecting them. Please join me in thanking Judith and Katie.